In the last lecture, we saw that Luther had gotten a hearing before the Diet of Worms, before he would be declared an outlaw in the empire. And on his trip down to Worms from Wittenberg, he was cheered on by huge, enthusiastic crowds of supporters all along the way, which pretty much amazed Luther, because he never realized that his ideas had gotten out that far and that he had such broad popular support. But now he's beginning to realize that. When he arrives in when he arrives in Worms, he goes directly to the hall where they're having the meeting of the Diet, and enters the hall. It's kind of like, imagine a basketball stadium where you have a floor and then around it raised seating. And Luther comes in on the floor level and he's walking in, and around him on the raised seating are essentially all the big politicians and rulers and political figures of Germany. Princes, dukes, counts, all the rulers of the small states. A lawyer from the Pope, a representative from the Pope, a lawyer from the Emperor, and even the Emperor himself, Charles V. And as Luther walks in and he sees this whole scene, he's stunned. Because remember, Luther's a rather simple man. He comes from peasant background, and to come to a place with all this assembled nobility was just really daunting for him. And he's kind of meek about it. He walks into the room, he kind of looks around and continues on up to the front. And at the front of the room, there's this table, and on the table there are a bunch of books. And he's just standing there for a second. And then the imperial examiner, the lawyer of the emperor, gets up. The emperor himself doesn't actually talk, of course. The examiner points to Luther and points to the table and says, "Martin Luther, are these your books?" Luther goes up and he pages through a few of the books and kind of looks at him and he says, meekly, "Yeah, these are my books." The examiner then says, "We are going to give you one chance to recant what you've written in these books. And if you do, we'll give you pardon. If you don't, you'll be subject to the consequences under law." And Luther's his first feeling is that he should say, "Yeah, okay, I'll recant it," because he's scared. He's really scared, and he's on the verge of saying that. But then he remembers all those people that turned out as he came down on his trip to Worms, and how they cheered him, and how they said, he was their hero and all that, and the support he had. And he thought to himself, now, if I recant all this, I'm going to look like a hypocrite, and I'm going to just basically, turn on all these people who are supporting me and betray them. I mean, how can I do that? So he's going back and forth, and he's not really saying anything, just thinking all these things. And the examiner says, "Well, I can see you're having a difficult time with this question, and it is a very serious question, so we will give you 24 hours to think it over. Come back here same time tomorrow and give us your answer." That Luther agrees to, because then now he can put it off and he can think about it more. So he goes back to his room, the room he took in the inn, and you can imagine what kind of night he had. I mean, probably didn't sleep a wink, thinking about what was going to happen to him if he didn't recant, but then thinking about all those people counting on him, and how could he really, betray all those people. And he went back and forth all night. Next day, he goes back to the assembly, walks into the same setting. He's not quite so cowed this time, because he's seen it once, and so he's a little bit more confidence, although still, he's a relatively inexperienced person in things like this. The imperial examiner puts the question to him again, "Will you recant?" And Luther answers no. He says, "These are my books. What I've written in these books, I wrote because of what my reason has told me, what my heart has told me, and I think it's right and true what I've said here, and so I won't take it back. Here I stand. God help me. Amen." At that point, the examiner says, "That's your answer. You now have 48 hours more free conduct before the law will come looking for you," essentially. So Luther goes out, he gets on his horse, and starts riding as fast as he can to try to get as far as he can back towards Wittenberg in the time allotted to him. Night falls. When the next day arrives, Luther has vanished. There's no trace of him on the road. There's no indication where he's gone or what's happened to him. He didn't make it back to Wittenberg. He's just vanished off the face of the earth almost. A lot of people think that maybe the imperial forces had secretly arrested him and taken him away. Maybe they'd even killed him and buried him somewhere. I mean, people don't really know what to think. What had actually happened was that representatives of Luther's prince, the Elector of Saxony, had in the middle of the night kidnapped Luther and taken him off to a secret castle location in the heart of the Black Forest, a place called the Wartburg Castle. And he's dressed up in clothes like a noble. They give him a sword, and they say, you're going to stay here and be in hiding for a while, and your name is going to be Junker Johann, or Noble Johann. So while Luther's in hiding here at the Wartburg Castle, he's being protected by the Elector because the Elector sees him as a valuable political asset to be used at a future time against the Emperor or even the Pope or other forces. And he's a very famous person and a valuable person that the Elector can use, and that's why he kidnapped him and has put him in hiding here at the Wartburg Castle. Nobody in Germany knows that Luther's there. Even the people at the castle don't know it's Luther. Just a few people know what the actual truth is. While Luther's in hiding at the Wartburg, his ideas spread fast across Germany. He gets many, many followers from all classes of society. Many ordinary people become followers of Luther, even in his absence, not knowing what's happened to him, because they see him as a German patriot, standing up against the foreign pope, which, that inspired them. Other ordinary people took Luther's idea of salvation by faith alone as their own personal solution to their spiritual anxiety, because it did for them what it did for Luther. It got them over the hump of, how can I be saved? So just lots and lots of common people followed him for that reason. Also, lots and lots of princes and politicians became followers of Luther, but for slightly different reasons. Their reasons were that, for the most part, they saw in Luther's rejection of papal control over the church a chance that they might take control over the church in their territories, and therefore get control over its appointments and its revenues and its lands, and increase their own state power in that way, which would be a part of the trend towards new monarchy, actually. And this is eventually what happens, in fact. And a lot of humanist scholars follow Luther because they see his ideas, especially his ideas about Bible reading, as being close to theirs. Well, while Luther's in hiding, back in his hometown of Wittenberg, strange stuff is happening. His followers back in Wittenberg, without his guidance and leadership, essentially get out of control. Lutheran crowds begin to do things that Luther never would have sanctioned had he been on the scene. They actually attack priests in the streets. They break into churches and destroy religious artwork. They reject the Mass and stop going to it. All sorts of extreme things. Among the leaders of these crowds is a man named Andreas Karlstadt, a former colleague of Luther's at the Wittenberg University. Other players in this drama are a group of people called the Prophets of Zwickau, who have come from a nearby town to be a part of the mix. They claim to have divine revelation directly from God that Luther's ideas are all correct, and they've been sent to kind of lead people. So it's a very, very controversial, difficult situation in Wittenberg. Eventually, Luther hears about it because, you can't keep things like this quiet for long, and Luther becomes extremely worried. He realizes if he doesn't do something to regain control of the situation, it could very easily just spiral completely into a disaster. So he makes the decision to leave Wartburg, give up his hiding and his disguise, go back to Wittenberg, and try to get things under control. When he goes back to Wittenberg, at first everyone's glad to see him because, they're glad that he's alive and well, apparently, and he's come back. But of course, Luther is in disagreement with a lot of what's happening in Zwickau and immediately begins trying to head things back in the direction he sees as being the correct one. And it's not easy, because once a situation, a kind of mass situation like this gets this far out of control, it's very difficult to rein it back in again. And Luther finds that he's got to go around to all the churches in Wittenberg, making repeated sermons to the people, trying to convince them that they should do things differently. Among the first things he does is he says, these prophets of Zwickau, they don't have any divine revelation. God doesn't give divine revelation directly to people to carry out his orders. So these guys are frauds. And he also just urged everybody in Wittenberg to exercise moderation. He said, what you're doing is just wrong. You've gone too fast, too far, and you're doing things that aren't right. You shouldn't be attacking priests. They're not your enemy. We've just seen that they're not what they claimed to be previously. And you should keep going to Mass, because if you don't go to Mass, you might not be saved. So Luther's really conservative here. You can see he has a conservative nature in some ways, and he's trying to get his supporters to back off. And eventually, because he's a convincing speaker and because he puts so much energy into it, he's able to regain control, and Wittenberg quietens down. However, this really causes Luther to have some reservations about what he'd assumed would be the course of his Reformation. He previously had assumed that he could carry out a reformation of the church by preaching directly to the people and just convincing them to follow him. But now he sees that especially ordinary people can easily misunderstand his ideas, and they can twist them and take them in their own directions, which could be very harmful and could be very, very different from what Luther had intended. So he starts to wonder whether he can carry out his Reformation on a popular scale like this, whether he can preach directly to the people and be successful. And you can see why he worried about that. But something happens next which convinces him that this worry is absolutely legitimate. And in fact, what happens next will change the whole course of the Protestant Reformation in Germany. That is the peasant revolt of 1525. Now, later on in the course, we're going to be looking in much greater detail at the peasant revolt, as a matter of fact, in the next lecture or two. But right now, I just want to show how the peasant revolt fits into the bigger picture of the Reformation. What it is a massive, and I mean massive, revolt of peasants all through southern Germany and into central Germany, starting in 1525. Peasant revolts weren't that unusual in the Middle Ages. We've already seen there were numerous in the 14th century, but this is a huge one. And it's different in that they use Luther's ideas as support for their rebellion. They claim to be revolting against authority because of ideas that Luther put forward. Well, this is an amazing set of events. The peasants are actually revolting against taxes. Landlord taxes, government taxes, that's their real gripe. But the problem is that you can't legitimize a revolt by saying you don't want to pay your taxes. There's no precedent for gaining legitimacy for a popular revolt based on really any kind of claim, but especially the claim that you don't want to pay your taxes. And so instead, the peasants, who are led by some Lutheran preachers who drift into the situation, claim to be inspired in their revolt by ideas that Luther has put forward, especially in his book On Christian Freedom. On Christian Freedom, Luther wrote, "The true Christian is not governed by the law." Now, what he meant was the true Christian is dependent on faith, and his salvation is not determined by the laws of the church, really. The peasants believe that Luther's saying that if you're a real Christian, you don't have to follow the law. And so they're rising up against the law. And their goal is nothing less than to overthrow the rulers of society and take power for themselves. Take over society. It's an honest-to-goodness social revolution, and as such, it's just what every noble and ruler in Europe has always feared, that population might someday rise up and try to take over. And in that sense, it's a real revolution. Revolution means the bottom goes to the top goes to the bottom, and that's what they're trying to do. And they're using Luther's ideas as a legitimization of it. other ideas they claim as